Welcome to the Gary DeMar blogcast, brought to you by Canon Press. Check us out at canonpress.com.
Welcome to the Gary DeMar blogcast. The topic of today's entry is the noble lie of modern ethics. If with God all things are possible, then without him all things are permissible. Few materialistic sophisticates want to believe that there is no justice and everything is permissible. They don't want to believe in moral anarchy so they can create a moral fiction. Loyal D. Rue, a professor of religion and philosophy at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, is honest enough to admit, given his materialistic worldview, that, quote, modern culture urgently needs a noble lie, a myth that links the moral teachings of religion with the scientific facts of life, close quote. Without these myths, for example, Jesus' resurrection and the Ten Commandments, Rue contends all that is left is nihilism, which considers life in the universe meaningless. If nihilism is all we have, then we are left with what is ultimately destructive, a monstrous truth. Here's the clincher. These myths served as a framework for religious teachings that brought about man's betterment, Rue says. Without their integration of cosmology and morality, of cosmic facts and idealism, people will deny fixed standards and do whatever they choose, splintering society. Or they might embrace the totalitarian option, which relies on government to force humans to behave, he said. With Rue's thesis in mind, consider the argument of Lee McAuliffe Rambo and her opposition to the Ten Commandment monument that was placed in the rotunda of the state Judicial building in Montgomery, Alabama, by former Chief Justice Roy Moore. She claimed that the idea that morality depends on religion is contradicted by the vast numbers of non-religious people who behave morally, many to an admirable degree. Now, it's certainly true that non-religious people have a moral code they follow. In fact, in the Apostle Paul's words, they are a law to themselves, and that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them. Romans chapter 2. Following Dr. Rue's thesis considering his materialistic worldview, which Rambo cannot refute, Paul's claim is mythological. How do Rambo and other non-religious people know they are behaving morally? Where does morality fit in a universe that popped into existence from a cosmic egg with no outside design or purpose? How do public school teachers, mandated to teach an atheistic version of origins, account for morality given the materialistic and atheistic assumptions of evolution? They can't. In 1897, Oliver Wendell Holmes, then a justice of the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, understood the dilemma Darwin had created for the legal profession, and he welcomed it. The Darwinian worldview allowed him to become a judicial sovereign. He did this by making a distinction between morality and legality. For my own part, he wrote, I often doubt whether it would not be a gain if every word of moral significance could be banished from the law altogether, and other words adopted which should convey legal ideas uncolored by anything outside the law, close quote. Of course, Holmes had to say this because he believed there was nothing outside the law. Strictly speaking, a materialist cannot account for law, any law, since law does not exist in material form. Unlike a drop of blood, there is no law to be put under the microscope. Still, Holmes did not want to live in a world where moral anarchy was the accepted worldview. And without an objective moral law, how would anyone know the difference between anarchy and order and which one was the better option? Like Rambo and her non-religious moralists, Holmes assumed an already existing body of law, but never explains why it is law and what makes it any right. He would never describe right as a moral precept. He can't do that because in the context of his own understanding of law, there's nothing outside that can be brought in to determine that something is right or not a right. Holmes called for an enlightened skepticism toward existing law. That is, he believed that the law as it stands should always be open to inquiry. What standard did Holmes use to make his enlightened determination of the validity of standing law. He didn't have one, and neither does Rambo. They both assume a moral universe, but they can't account for it. How about the Greeks? Do the Greeks have a standard by which you can determine what was in fact right or wrong, morally acceptable or not? Rambo appeals to the morality of Socrates, who is considered the founder of ethics and one of the most upright people who ever lived. Yet there is no evidence that he believed in a god who issued decrees. Why did Rambo pick Socrates over Hitler? Why is the moral worldview of Socrates any more right than that of Stalin? Like most non-religious moralists, Rambo picks and chooses what she believes is moral because it conforms to what she already believes. The question remains, how does one account for morality? Why is one kind of behavior right and another wrong? Socrates never figured it out. How about a study of Greek and Roman natural law that was seen as a worthy answer and substitute for revealed law and contributed to the reasonable pursuit of slavery based on nature? Aristotle justified slavery on the ground that it was in accord with nature. The Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius understood that nothing is evil which is according to nature. The Greek moralists believed reason was the best way to develop a moral worldview. So what was the net effect of reason? What we know of Socrates comes by way of Plato, one of his pupils. Plato believed that becoming a slave was not simply a matter of bad luck. Rather, in his view, nature creates a slavish people, lacking the mental capacity for virtue or culture and fit only to serve. Because slaves have no souls, they have no human rights, and masters can treat them as they will. Now, the question is, who's to disagree? On what grounds? Aristotle's cosmology, geocentrism, that the fact that the earth was the center of the universe, an ethical system, pro-slavery, had a deeply negative impact on the Western world. For example, the enslavement of native people during the early modern period was defended through Aristotelian teaching that barbarians are inherently inferior to civilized people and suited by nature to slavery. Aristotle went on to argue that without slaves to do the labor, enlightened men would lack the time and energy to pursue virtue and wisdom. He additionally justified slavery by drawing upon Plato's biological claims. Slavery is justified because slaves are more akin to dumb brutes than to free men. Left on their own, slaves would be ruled solely by their appetites, causing endless civic harm. Close quote. Aristotle offered scientific reasons to justify slavery. Some people are just born that way. From the hour of their birth, some are marked for subjection, others for rule. Aristotle's argument was one of many used throughout history to defend slavery, including in the antebellum United States. American slaveholders incorporated much of Aristotle's argument, claiming the following: slavery was necessary for a leisured aristocracy. Slavery benefited the enslaved, so-called planter paternalism. Slavery was justified because some people, black people, according to racist whites, were inherently less rational and intelligent. Scholars have pointed out the natural law variety of slavery promoted by Aristotle and its impact on how Native Americans were treated. Of all the ideas churned up during the early tumultuous years of American history, none had a more dramatic application than the attempts made to apply to the natives the Aristotelian doctrine of natural slavery, that one part of mankind is set aside by nature to be slaves in the service of masters born for a life of virtue free of manual labor. Without a transcendent lawgiver, a personal God who reveals his will, how is it possible to argue against them? How does one prove that a person is not marked for subjection? Remember what Holmes wanted for the jurist: to convey legal ideas uncolored by anything outside the law. As Suzanne Everett writes in History of Slavery, it is an uncomfortable fact that the Greeks, from whom we derive so many of our intellectual and political ideals, were utterly dependent on slavery. The same can be said about Rome. Any change in the law is in the hands of those who control the law. If there is no God, then either man individually is a law unto himself, that is moral autonomy, or man corporately, statist oppression. In our case, it's the courts. we have turned legal rights and wrongs, there is no morality, over to 5 members of the Supreme Court, 5 unelected members of the Supreme Court. In 1907, Supreme Court Justice Charles Evan Hughes said, "We are under a constitution, but the Constitution is what the judges say it is." Since the Constitution is the law of the land, it follows that the law is what the judges say it is. In Trott versus Dulles, Judge Earl Warren stated that the Constitution must draw its meaning from the evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society. Notice the oxymoron, evolving standards. How in the world can standards evolve? Well, they can evolve because the justices, the judges, who are not bound by any transcendent outside law, can make the law and determine what the law is going to be based upon their assumptions about reality. If it's a standard, how can it evolve? John W. Whitehead shows that the presupposition of constitutionalism was implicitly refuted by Justice Felix Frankfurter when, in speaking of the Supreme Court justices, he said that it is they who speak and not the Constitution. Also, the Supreme Court itself held in a 1958 decision, Article 6 of the Constitution makes the Constitution the supreme law of the land. It is emphatically the province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is. It follows that the interpretation of the Constitution enunciated by the court is the supreme law of the land. Back to Rambo. Rambo concludes her article by stating, "Today, ethicists hold that folks, both religious and secular, can achieve the highest level of morality, doing what is right because it is intrinsically good. Why should anyone follow what today's ethicists hold to be moral, or what is supposedly intrinsically good? What does intrinsically good mean? How do we find this intrinsic good? Aristotle believed that slavery was an innate condition, and therefore intrinsically good. It was certainly good for those who owned slaves, but it was horrible for those who were subjected to slavery."
Thank you for listening to the Gary DeMar blogcast. For more from Gary and American Vision, check out the American Vision collection in the Canon app.